Toni Jordan's 9 Days starts with a black and white photograph on the book's cover. It interweaves 9 lives, shifting backwards and forwards in time. It's an ambitious experiment for the writer and the reader. Toni Jordan, welcome to Booktopia.
It's a pleasure, Caroline.
Tell us how your novel 9 Days begins with a photograph.
When I finished writing my second book, I had no ideas whatsoever. I had the curse of the flashing cursor, where you just sit in front of the screen and it's taunting you. And my publisher here in Australia rang to check how I was going, and the answer was badly. And he said that he had a photograph that he had found quite a number of years earlier in the archives of the State Library of Victoria, and he thought it was the most romantic and evocative image he'd ever seen. And would I have a look at it? And so I did.
Okay, so what was it about this image, Toni? I mean, obviously, these are two people who are young, handsome, there's something kind of intense going on there, but why do you think this image resonated so powerfully for you?
Well, originally it didn't. I really don't see myself as a very visual person. I'm the kind of person who goes to the art gallery and then reads the little signs next to the pictures before I look at them to try and intellectualise the context. So I hung it on my wall above my desk, and it took nearly a year. And then one day I was sitting at my desk and looking up at it, and I just thought, I know who those people are, I know about their families, I know what happens to them, and everything seemed to fall into place. I think it's terribly romantic, this stretching to kiss, and I only hope that kiss happens, but you just never quite know. I just found it so full of possibility and so obvious that there was a story behind there.
The structure of the book is so particular in terms of taking 9 people's lives, 9 days, non-sequential, non-chronological.
It seemed to me, in looking at that photo, that even though there was 2 people there, it seemed to me to be a broader story than that. There's other people surrounding them in the picture, but I also just had a sense of this web of connectedness sort of coming out from them. And I thought about their relatives and the neighbours and the neighbourhood where they lived. And I think the past is a very powerful sort of thought for all of us, but sometimes it doesn't make sense at the time when we're living something. Sometimes only in retrospect do things fall into place. So I wanted to kind of create an idea of these threads of connectedness that run through people, and also the way things become important through families, the way things are passed down through families.
Well, 2 of those things, 2 objects in the book, link the narrative, and they are a lucky shilling and a necklace. Can you just say a little bit about the potency of objects and why you used those as a device?
Well, there's a practical reason for that. As you said, it's non-sequential, non-chronological, 9 different first-person voices. So I'm kind of asking the reader to take my hand and trust that I know what I'm doing. And there is a lot of things that are kind of undercurrents in the book about traits and experiences that are passed down through families. So I guess I wanted a few things to be concrete. I wanted an actual object that was passed through a family, and there's those 2, and there's also really the photograph itself as an object that appears in a number of chapters, because I thought if I'm sort of moving the reader around so much, at least I should give them something solid to stand upon in those areas.
You also embed this story very much in time, in various different times, and in this location, the inner city suburb of Richmond. I was wondering how much you knew about 1939 and about that era when you started.
Absolutely embarrassingly nothing. And in my first draft, I'd only ever written contemporary stories before. And things like the language and the geography and the bridges that were built and buildings that were in different places. It was only after I finished the first draft that I realised how completely inadequate it actually was. And I had to go back with a really targeted researcher's mind and find all these things that I didn't know. It was honestly, I don't know that I'll ever attempt historical fiction again. It's just another level of difficulty. I'm very fortunate that my grandmother is 95 and still alive. She lives in Queensland, in Nambour. And so I was able to think back about the language that she used when she was, I spent a great deal of time with her when I was a child. And I would ring up Mum and say, just nip up and see Gran and ask her how she would say this. But there's also terrific reference books from that period. You know, I had my boys walking to school on the completely wrong way because I assumed that the bridges were still there and they weren't. I had the school that they go to in the wrong spot. It was really quite, I didn't realise how much I hadn't known.
Because one of the other things that, of course, going back in time to a time that is within the framework of, say, the memory of your grandmother, is to realise how much our values have changed, particularly in relation to women. And it seems to me that this book is very subtle and has a very light touch in the way it deals with social hypocrisy and issues of class.
To me, that's what it's about to a large extent. I know, I mean, it's certainly not the story of my family, but I have a family like that. My grandmother was in domestic service from when she was 13. The women in my family have always worked. So there was no 60s revolution for our family about women working. We were kind of looking for a revolution where we didn't have to work, actually, in reverse. And it certainly didn't have to take place in Richmond. It could have been Balmain, or it could have been West End in Brisbane, or it could have been any number of these suburbs that have also made this shift from working class to gentrified middle class suburbs. So the theme of the kind of work that women did and the role that women have in anchoring families, I think is a really important one. It's not a recent innovation. It's something that's always been with us.
But also there's religion, isn't there, in the mix here?
Yeah. And again, that was something else that I didn't really realise. You kind of think of Catholic Protestant tensions being something that belongs overseas. And I was kind of just toying with that as an idea, and the more people I mentioned it to, the more stories I started to hear about, you know, my friend, her parents didn't see her again after she married this person, or the divisions in families, the divisions between siblings. And it was actually such a enormously big deal back then. And it really makes me think about the things that we think are big deals today, and how in a few years' time people will be saying, what? I can't believe they're even worried about that. Exactly. It puts that kind of thing in perspective.
And another thing that you raise is the issue of the men who don't go to war and what their reasons might be for not joining up.
Yes. It certainly is not a black and white issue. And one of the things that interests me so much is this gap between public and private personas of people. And that's really, I think that's constant through my three novels. The idea that someone appears this way on the outside, and then when you see them from the inside, they're completely different. This space between the outward vision of somebody and their internal thoughts is, to me, the most interesting part of fiction and the most interesting part of life.
So who was your favourite character to write out of the 9?
I really liked Jack, who's our hero and the soldier on the front cover. He was in my first draft, he was the most difficult because, again, talking about this difference between external and internal personas, I like the idea that on the outside he might be considered a normal Aussie kind of guy. His sentences are quite short. He doesn't wax lyrical, but on the inside he's incredibly poetic and a great appreciation for nature and the countryside, and a very thoughtful and sensitive man.
Now, you've made a point of saying in the past, I think, that you like the reader to kind of do some of the work and that you see the novel as being half created by the writer and half created by the reader. Why are you so interested in that dynamic and what the reader brings?
Well, this is the most exciting part of fiction, and this is why it's never-endingly fascinating, because it is this half and half. It's this conversation between two people who most of the time never meet, and it's why every novel is different for every reader, because they bring their own imagination and they imagine the characters look differently and sound differently, and they bring their own preconceptions and prejudices. So it's this it's not just about the ink on the page, otherwise everyone would agree. And it's not like sitting in a movie theatre where you can actually see the people exactly what they look like and hear exactly what they sound like. It's this indeterminate blending. To me, that's the most exciting part of fiction.
And Toni, what have you found out about the photographs since the book came out? Have people contacted you with any kind of indications about who these people might be?
Well, we've had a couple of hints. And the first is that toward the front of a photo, there's someone who looks like a policeman with stripes on his sleeve. And I assumed it was taken in Victoria because it was from the State Library of Victoria. But people have suggested that that's actually a New South Wales police uniform at the time, and maybe that carriage is a New South Wales train carriage. So perhaps it's a shot from Sydney after all, which I can think that's kind of supports the universality of this story, that it could have taken place anywhere.
Toni Jordan has such affection for her characters that you shouldn't be surprised if you become attached to them too. This is a hard book to forget and will also make you ask yourself how much you know about your family and its past.